Hands behind your back! Who the hell do you think you are, ignoring my orders?" the officer roared, slamming the woman's face onto the lid of a foul-smelling dumpster in the middle of the park. He ratcheted the handcuffs tight enough to draw blood, sneering at her grime-streaked janitor's uniform, relishing the chance to crush a lowlife who dared to stumble upon his crime scene. But that smug grin vanished at the precinct when his trembling hand pulled a heavy object from her coat pocket. It wasn't trash, it was a gold badge embossed with the words, "Department of Justice." He had just handcuffed a federal prosecutor, a woman with the power to dismantle this entire corrupt system. A heavy silence filled the room as the realization of his fatal mistake set in. She wasn't the prey, but the hunter, working undercover to find evidence of the lives they had stolen. The door slammed shut, but this time, the fear belonged to the man with the gun. Will her true identity be enough to get her out of the wolf's den alive? Or will they murder justice itself to bury their final crime? If this were your parents being treated this way, would you stay silent or take a stand? Let us know in the comments, and watch this video to the end to see why justice cannot wait a single second longer. Greenline Park in the late afternoon wore a calm that strangers were quick to believe. But for those who had lived long enough in the town of Hawthorne Ridge, that quiet felt like a thin sheet of cloth, draped over something rotten beneath. The wind sweeping across the lake carried the smell of stagnant water, and the old trees rustled softly as if trying to hide what they were forced to witness every night. Arthur Mays sat on his familiar stone bench, leaning close to the thin backpack beside him, as though afraid the wind might carry it away at any moment. The old man was accustomed to the sounds of the park at this hour. The children's voices had long vanished. The joggers were gone as well, leaving only the breathing of the trees and the occasional footsteps of police officers appearing at hours that did not resemble routine patrols. Arthur pulled his torn jacket up to cover his chest when he saw the familiar patrol car turn onto the path, its lights switching off the moment it passed, the sign reading, "End of parking area." He let out a sigh, as small as the breath of an animal long accustomed to being cornered, and muttered to himself that these people never let anyone breathe in peace. In the town, everyone knew Holt, and the men under his command liked to stop by the park at hours when no one wanted to be outside watching, yet no one dared to ask what they were doing. Arthur had seen enough to know when to lower his head and keep his distance, but tonight he had sat in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and even breathed at the wrong moment. When the car door opened, Arthur backed into the shadow of a tree, struggling to suppress the cough tightening in his chest. Holt stepped out first, his posture calm, as if performing a routine task, though only Arthur knew that calm was a mask. A strange man approached, broad-shouldered, wearing an old jacket, and Holt handed him a small package. Though Arthur tried to turn his face away, he still saw the fingers clenched tightly around that parcel, then saw Holt receive an envelope in return. The scene was simple, yet it carried something that made Arthur's throat constrict. Fear, rising like a sudden fever. He covered his mouth, forcing each breath to be as shallow as possible. But the cough that had plagued him for years in the cold nights betrayed him. The cough burst out, not loud, but in the heavy stillness of the park, it sounded like a stone thrown onto the surface of the lake. Doyle spun around, eyes narrowing into sharp slits, and barked out a demand to know who was there. Arthur understood it was too late. His unsteady legs carried him forward, his trembling hands raised in panic. He tried to speak, but no sound. "Ce," trying to show them he meant no trouble, trying to make himself appear as small as possible. But in Doyle's eyes, that smallness looked like a thorn that needed to be pulled out immediately. Doyle grabbed Arthur by the collar and yanked him up as one would lift an old sack. The strength of a younger man slammed into the frail body, sending pain through Arthur until his feet nearly left the ground. Doyle demanded to know what Arthur had seen, his voice thick with menace. Arthur tried to breathe, but his breath came in broken gasps. He sobbed and begged that he had seen nothing, that he swore he would tell no one, that he only wanted to sleep through one peaceful night. Each word slipped painfully from his worn throat. But Doyle did not care whether the old man was shaking from fear or from the cold. He cared only that Arthur had been standing in the wrong place at the worst possible moment. Holt walked over, slow, like a man considering a defective piece of merchandise. This old man had seen enough to become a nuisance, Holt said in a flat voice, sharp as a knife hidden in cloth. Arthur stumbled back a step, his panicked eyes searching for escape like an old bird, realizing its nest had been stripped bare. He said again that he would not tell anyone, that he only wanted to survive the night, and those words made Doyle laugh in irritation. Without waiting for Holt to give the order a second time, Doyle drove Arthur's head into the tree trunk with his full arm. The dry crack made Holt's face twitch slightly, but Doyle did not pause to check whether Arthur was still conscious. The old man managed only a weak sound before collapsing like a coat slipping from its hanger. Doyle bent down to check him, then told Holt that now the old man would not remember anything. Holt looked at the curled body at his feet, his face showing no emotion, like someone long accustomed to making decisions that erased others from the world. Holt ordered everything cleaned up. Tonight, the park had no one named Arthur Mays. Doyle nodded and began dragging Arthur's body toward the bushes to hide it from view. The wind passed through, carrying the smell of damp earth mixed with a metallic tang, newly born. Arthur had lived quietly, and now he died so quietly that no one nearby knew the town had just lost a human being. Before Doyle kicked leaves over the body, a small object rolled away from Arthur's foot, its faint sound skimming across the dirt before stopping beside the base of a tree. A shard of glass, smeared with blood, reflected the last light of day. Neither man noticed it, yet it was the only thing Arthur left behind for the world. A tiny piece of evidence with the power to shatter the false calm of Hawthorne Ridge. Morning at the federal prosecutor's office was like any other, sunlight brushing the edges of the desks and revealing thin outlines of dust the cleaning crew had missed. Elena had just set down her hot coffee, her mind still on the afternoon meeting, when her eyes caught a brown envelope lying askew atop a stack of case files. It did not resemble internal mail, nor did it look like documents routed from another department. The crease along the envelope's edge curled upward, as if someone had slipped it onto the desk while the workspace was empty. Elena paused for a few seconds, sensing something out of place, before pulling her chair closer and opening the envelope with the slowest movement she could manage. Inside was a handwritten letter in slanted script, the ink slightly smudged at the corner of the page, as though the writer had been rushed or trembling. The first line made Elena's back straighten on instinct. "They killed him. They are corrupting this town. If you do not come, there will be more deaths." The words were rough, yet decisive, like a blade pressing against the softest part of her chest. Elena read it a second time to be sure she had not misunderstood, because accusations like these were not something just anyone dared put on paper. Especially when the accused were local police. She ran her fingertip along the section describing Arthur Mays's death in concrete detail. He was slammed headfirst into a tree. It was not an accident. Each word seemed to carry its own weight, heavy enough to make her chest feel constricted. The letter also described the handoff of a package, a patrol car with its lights turned off, and the name Holt appearing in a context that left no room for confusion. Elena set the letter down on her desk and looked at it as one would look at a sudden fissure opening beneath their feet. This was not a vague denunciation or a bitter rant written for spite. It carried the scent of a genuine plea for help, a plea from someone standing dangerously close to the edge. Elena stood up, stepped out of her office, and asked each colleague whether they had been the one to place the envelope on her desk. The person at the outer desk said They had seen no strangers come in. The colleague in the adjacent office shook their head repeatedly, eyes darting away even though no further questions were asked. Their reactions told Elena that the letter had certainly arrived by another route, perhaps while she had stepped away for a meeting. Perhaps when someone waited for the precise moment, the hallway was empty. The collective silence weighed on her mind, as though the entire office sensed something was wrong, but no one dared touch it. Back in her office, Elena opened her computer and typed in Arthur Mays's name. The file that appeared was painfully sparse, just a few lines noting a homeless man who had been asked by police to leave the park several times for sleeping there overnight. There was no accident report, no record of any intervention within the past 2 months. The emptiness of the file only made the letter on her desk more credible. She continued combing through records of incidents at Green Line Park and began to notice small events overlapping in strange ways, from reports of falls due to loss of balance to self-inflicted contact with a stone bench, and then several cases of homeless individuals disappearing from the area altogether. Each dot alone meant nothing, but when connected, they formed an abnormal curve that any careful observer would find suspicious. Elena sat quietly for a moment, gazing out the window where the sun was half-veiled by clouds. The city looked calm, yet she knew that ugly things often multiplied silently, right beneath that calm surface. A dull ache swelled in her chest, prompting her to press a hand against her sternum and slow her breathing. She reminded herself that her responsibility was not to dismiss the letter, but to determine whether it was a genuine cry for help, and if it was, then whoever had sent it was placing their hope in her. She stood up, the envelope in hand, and stepped into the hallway. Each step felt heavy, as though she were wading into deep water. She knew that bringing this letter to Mercer was no small matter. He was cautious, a man who insisted everything follow procedure. Yet, there were things that lay beyond procedure, things that could not wait another day. The hallway was brightly lit, but Elena felt a growing chill as she neared Mercer's office, as if sensing that the path ahead would offer no way back. Elena knocked and heard Mercer tell her to come in. He was reviewing data charts, his face intent. Elena placed the letter on his desk and gently slid it toward him. Mercer glanced at it, then looked up, his dark eyes seeming to read all of her thoughts in a single moment. Elena said that if they ignored this letter, they might be indirectly signing another death sentence. Her voice was not loud, but it was firm enough to leave no room for dismissal. Mercer opened the letter and read each line slowly. Elena stood still, listening to the silence thicken inside the room. He did not ask what she thought, nor what she wanted, only studied her for a long time, as if measuring how far she was willing to go. Finally, he set the letter down, leaned back in his chair, and said that he was not sure she understood what she was about to touch. Mercer's office was always lit by a solemn yellow glow, as if every story that entered this room was required to carry its truest nature with it. Elena stood before his desk, one hand resting on the back of a chair but not sitting down. The accusatory letter lay between them, a thin sheet of paper whose weight made the entire room feel as though it were closing in. Mercer flipped through the letter once more, his eyes stopping at the passage describing Arthur Mays and the package exchanged in the park, then set it down, remaining silent, long enough for Elena to feel the air thicken. When he looked up, the calm he usually wore was gone, replaced by a thin layer of wariness, like ice newly spread across the surface of a lake. "Do you realize this could shatter your career?" Mercer asked, his voice steady but dry, like stone against stone. He folded his arms and leaned back in his chair, studying Elena's face to see whether she truly understood the consequences. Elena did not hesitate for a second. "I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't." The words came out like a reflex, without searching for language, and Mercer understood that she had decided long before she stepped into the room. Mercer let out a sigh so heavy it made the desk lamp tremble slightly. He opened the cabinet beneath his desk and took out a small black box. When the lid popped open, Elena saw a tracking bracelet that looked like cheap jewelry, yet Mercer held it between two fingers, as if gripping a piece of live explosive. Pressing this button means you have only a few minutes left to survive. He placed the bracelet into Elena's hand, the cold of the metal spreading through her fingers, like a reminder that nothing from this moment on would be the same. Mercer continued, "I can't approve this officially, but I'm allowing you to conduct a preliminary assessment. Understand?" The phrase preliminary assessment carried more meaning than its softened syntax suggested, as if another darker layer lay hidden between the words one both of them had to pretend not to see. Elena nodded. She turned the bracelet in her hand, looking at it as something suspended between life and death. On its surface was a tiny button, almost invisible to the naked eye. "If I have to use this," she said quietly, "then things will already be far beyond reach." Mercer planted both hands on the desk, his expression hardening. "You cannot use your real identity. No badge. No one can know who you are." He spoke each word as if sealing every door behind her, cutting off any retreat. "If local police catch even a whiff of federal involvement, they'll bury every trace before you set foot in the park." Elena replied immediately, without hesitation, "I'll go as someone not worth noticing." There was no pride in her voice, only the calm confirmation of someone who had accepted the risk long before it arrived. Mercer studied her for a few more seconds, his gaze softening slightly but losing none of its concern. "And you do this alone, Ward?" He paused, leaning forward just a little. "If this is a trap, they'll erase you before I can even pick up the phone." His voice carried something Elena rarely heard from him, genuine worry behind the ever-present steel discipline. Elena pressed her lips together briefly, then said, "I've thought about that. But if someone is frightened enough to send an anonymous letter, that person has no one left to rely on. At the very least, they need to see that someone is listening." The sentence was simple, yet it weighed heavily in Mercer's eyes. He understood that Elena was not the type to walk away after hearing such a thing, and that made his decision all the more difficult. Mercer stood and walked to the window. Outside stretched a long line of streets, traffic flowing by in steady routine. No one aware that an exchange inside this room might soon alter an entire town. He turned back to Elena, his voice low and deliberate. "Ward, once you step into this, there's no turning back. If you doubt yourself, if there's any part of you that wants to pull away, now is the moment." Elena met his gaze. "I don't doubt anything." Mercer gave a small nod, returned to the desk, slipped the letter into a file folder, and locked the drawer. "Good. From this point on, your actions are outside the sight of this entire office. I will only intervene if your tracker activates." He extended a hand as if to touch Elena's shoulder, then withdrew it, keeping the distance of someone who knew that too much reassurance could make the other person's hands tremble. Elena fastened the bracelet around her wrist, its cold, slightly heavy presence feeling as though it held far more than she had been told. She tightened her fingers, steadying herself, reminding herself that every decision carried a price, and she was willing to pay it if it meant saving someone else's life. She turned and walked toward the door, but as she crossed the threshold, Mercer called after her, his voice deeper than before. "Ward, be careful with what you think you already know. This town has more layers than you realize." Elena stopped in the hallway without turning back, speaking softly, just loud enough for him to hear. "That's exactly why I have to go down there." The door closed behind her, and Mercer exhaled, a long, heavy breath. He looked toward the end of the corridor, where the lights did not quite reach. A door at the far end had just closed, softly, as if someone had been standing there too long and then left in haste. The sight darkened Mercer's gaze, because he understood that any ears that had overheard the conversation just now were a danger in themselves. Morning at Green Line Park carried the pale light characteristic of places long accustomed to secrets. Dew still clung to the blades of grass, but it held none of the usual poetry. Instead, resembling the residue left behind after an exhausting night. Elena entered the park wearing a reflective vest, a trash grabber in her hand like a new employee still unfamiliar with the work. She kept her breathing steady, blending into the role Mercer had instructed her to play, careful that no one could see the observation in her eyes instead of the vague distraction of someone new to the job. The air here smelled cold, the scent of a place where everyone knew something had happened, yet no one dared to name it. A man walked past her with a dog. The dog tugged slightly when it noticed Elena, and its owner scanned her from head to toe. That look held no curiosity. It was more like he was weighing whether to warn her or simply leave. In the end, he tightened the leash and quickened his pace, never looking back. Elena noted every small detail, the tension visible in the man's shoulders, the way he kept his distance as if she were an explosive that might detonate if handled incorrectly. It only made her more aware that Green Line Park was no longer an ordinary park. It felt like a container of fear, where everyone passing through carried a secret in their chest. When Elena reached the drink stand, Jessie Bloom was wiping down the counter with a frayed cloth. Jessie looked at her for a few seconds, then asked quietly, "You new here? Around here. Don't look too long at things that aren't your business." Her voice was low and rushed, as if someone were standing just behind both of them. Elena smiled with practiced naivety. "I'm just picking up trash, that's all." Jessie pressed her lips together, her eyes flicking toward the path leading to the eastern lawn, where Arthur had once sat. Sure, picking up trash, but knowing where to stop. The words echoed in Elena's mind, even after she had moved far from the stand. They sounded like a warning, not a simple concern. She walked along the path by the lake, the grabber tapping against dry leaves while her thoughts were elsewhere. Near the edge of the trail, patches of grass were trampled hard. The soil churned as if something heavy had been dragged across it. The disturbed earth looked fresh, not yet dried. Elena paused for a few seconds, crouching to inspect it, maintaining the careless posture of a hired cleaner. But her eyes memorized every mark. The wind swept across the lake, carrying the smell of stagnant water, mixing with the scent of freshly turned soil, sending a shiver through her. At one corner of the park, a patrol car was parked crookedly beneath the trees. The lights were off, the door cracked open just a fraction. Yet, the interior was too dark to make out anything inside. The entire scene felt distinctly wrong. A patrol car sitting empty in the middle of the morning was never a coincidence. Elena kept moving, her pace even so as not to draw attention. She felt her heartbeat slow into a heavy rhythm, the quiet instinct telling her she was stepping into the area the letter's sender had tried to warn her about. Elena bent down to pick up a few scraps of trash, the grabber making a small sound as it clamped onto an empty can. But in that very moment, she sensed eyes on her from somewhere behind. A fixed stare, not openly hostile, but intense enough to chill her spine. Elena did not turn around, observing instead from the corner of her eye. Between the tree trunks lining the path was a patch of darkness deeper than the rest, as if someone stood there, ready to merge back into shadow whenever she might turn her head. The wind stirred the leaves gently, but the silence remained intact. Elena drew in a deep breath, steadying herself. She had known this assignment would be dangerous, but that unseen presence doubled the threat. She moved on, her hand tightening around the handle of the grabber as though it were the only weapon she had. Another sanitation worker approached from the lakeside. It was Marcy, a thin woman with dark circles under her eyes, always looking as if she had not slept. Marcy bent to gather fallen leaves, then whispered as she straightened up, "You shouldn't be here alone. Someone disappeared here once." Her voice trembled, as though she herself were afraid of the words she had just spoken. Elena crouched to pick up a small scrap of paper, hiding her reaction. "Disappeared?" she asked, her tone casual, as if merely keeping up polite conversation. Marcy shook her head, her gaze darting away. "I don't know anything. That's just what I heard." Then she moved on. So quickly it seemed she feared standing beside Elena any longer might pull her into something she could not escape. Elena stopped beneath a large tree, listening to the park with every sense. The wind over the lake, the traffic on the main road, the scattered footsteps of a few walkers. Everything felt normal to a suspicious degree. Normal, as if the park itself were trying to conceal the truth beneath its familiar surface. But Elena knew that normalcy was only a mask hastily patched on after Arthur's death. She continued toward the end of the trail. The ground there changed color, darker, damper than elsewhere, as if it had been dug up and filled in again in a hurry. Elena crouched and brushed her fingers lightly across the soil. It was soft and cold like old mud. Despite the sunlight that had been out since morning, her heart skipped into a heavier beat, because instinct told her this place had swallowed something people did not want found again. Elena stood before the large tree, where the ground was darker than elsewhere, the disturbed strip stretching several inches like a wound that had not yet had time to close. She knelt, her hand lightly touching the damp, cold soil. A breeze slipped through, stirring the leaves overhead, and in that moment, Elena felt as though this place had once drawn in the final breath of a human being. She whispered, her voice so low it was almost soundless. "Arthur, you fell here, didn't you?" The words dissolved into the air, yet Elena sensed the wind around her shift, as if answering back. She used the trash grabber to gently push aside a layer of rotting leaves. Debris from past seasons fell away, revealing a patch of compacted earth, darker than the rest, as though it had once absorbed a heavy impact. Elena leaned closer, her breath hovering over the moist ground. Beneath a curled leaf edge, something caught the faint light. Elena brushed away another layer of leaves, and when the shard of glass was fully revealed, a chill ran down her spine. The dark brown smear clinging to the edge of the glass could not be mistaken for anything else. A color that, even after many days, still retained its own testimony. Elena picked up the shard. The instant her fingertips touched the glass edge, a sound erupted in her mind. Crack. Short, sharp, haunting, like the sound of bone breaking against something hard. The image of the tree casting its shadow on the ground made that sound echo even deeper. Elena closed her eyes for a single breath. And in that flash, she imagined the moment Arthur was dragged here, forced back against the trunk, and then stripped of his life as if he had never been part of this town at all. She opened her eyes, slipped the shard into her jacket pocket, and drew in a steady breath to calm herself. The cold, rough feel of metal against fabric made her understand that this day had crossed into a different boundary. She knew she was holding evidence that someone had tried to erase, and she understood clearly that, though it was only a small shard of glass, it had now bound her fate to that of Arthur Mays. The realization tightened her stomach, as if she had just signed an unspoken contract to step into a confrontation with no retreat. Footsteps behind her made Elena turn her head slightly. A man's voice rang out, rough and edged with a growl. "Hey, you there! What are you digging around for?" The voice carried the irritation of someone accustomed to using authority to conceal what he did not want seen. Elena rose slowly, keeping her shoulders loose like an ordinary sanitation worker doing her job. When she turned fully, Doyle stood a few steps away. His eyes held no curiosity, only warning, like the gaze of someone who already knew that anyone who looked too closely at his business would pay for it. He stepped closer, the grass beneath his boots giving off a small, dull sound, like a foot pressing down on something fragile. "What did you just put in your pocket?" he asked, his voice lower, sharper. Elena felt her heart rate rise, but her face remained calm. The composure honed through years of facing witnesses. "Just trash," she replied evenly. "I'm doing my job." Doyle narrowed his eyes, scanning her face as if searching every corner for a crack. "In this park, what counts as trash? I'm the one who decides." He moved closer still, the distance shrinking until Elena could smell cigarette smoke and the sour sweat clinging to the collar of his uniform. Elena shifted slightly to create space, her hand still gripping the trash grabber. "I was assigned this area. Is there a problem?" The question was light, but it held just enough edge to draw another few measured breaths from Doyle before he reacted. His lips twitched into a brief, venomous smile. He tilted his head, looking her up and down. "You're new, right? I can tell you don't know the rules here yet." He lowered his voice, even though only the wind and leaves surrounded them. "The rule here is not to touch what isn't yours. Is that?" Elena kept her gaze from meeting the challenge in his eyes, lowering her hand as if preparing to move on. But Doyle did not give her the chance. His hand shot out fast, rough fingers reaching for Elena's wrist. The motion was forceful, as though he had already decided to seize any excuse to close the distance. Elena twisted slightly to avoid him, but Doyle still caught her wrist, his fingers tightening for a brief moment, charged with latent violence. The sensation made Elena's breath stall for half a second, because she understood one thing with absolute clarity. From the moment his hand touched her, the story in Hawthorne Ridge had crossed a point of no return. The wind in the park rose suddenly, sweeping across the lake and then funneling toward the two of them. Elena looked up at Doyle's face and saw something in his eyes larger than suspicion. A vague recognition that she was not like the others who lowered their heads and stepped out of his way. That look sent a cold line down her spine, because she knew this man had silenced weaker voices many times before through sheer brutality. Doyle tightened his grip once more and asked, "What's your name?" The question sounded like a command meant to seize control, not a gesture of interest. Elena answered softly, "I just started working here. I'm trying to finish my shift." Her voice was calm, but beneath it a current was beginning to swell. Doyle stared straight into her eyes, his gaze dark as the surface of the lake when clouds roll in. "You'd better remember your boundaries. People who cross this line usually don't find a way back out." The moment the wind shifted, Elena knew Doyle had decided not to let her leave that tree unharmed. His breath brushed the back of her neck, hot like a warning. Before she could step aside, his rough hand clamped onto her wrist, the force so strong she could clearly hear the sound of a joint being pulled out of line. "Give me your hand, you little bastard. Don't make me say it again." Doyle snarled, standing so close that the smell of cigarettes and his anger fused into something that made Elena's stomach tighten. Elena tried to keep her voice steady, even as the crushing grip on her wrist made her want to gasp. "I'm working. You don't have the right." She did not finish the sentence before Doyle jerked violently, twisting her arm behind her back, like snapping a dry branch. A sharp pain shot from her shoulder down to her waist, stealing the air from her lungs. She lowered her head, forcing herself not to groan, knowing that even the smallest sign of weakness would only multiply Doyle's violence. He slammed her against the tree trunk, her shoulder crashing into the rough bark and sending a burning sting across her skin. "In this park, your rights are whatever I say you have," he said, his voice blunt and hollow, like someone used to speaking crimes in the tone of everyday routine. The smell of damp earth rising from the base of the tree made Elena feel nauseated, as if the very spot where Arthur had fallen was now passing its truth on to her. Elena clenched her teeth, trying to push her back away from the trunk despite Doyle's tight hold. "I haven't violated anything. You're abusing your authority." Her voice was not loud, but it was firm, each word an act of resistance against the fear twisting in her gut. Doyle laughed, a short sound thick with contempt. "Abusing it? So what? Is there anyone here brave enough to open their mouth for you? He turned his head and scanned the area in challenge, and Elena followed his gaze. A few dozen steps away, two adults walking with a child paused for a beat when they saw what was happening, then bent down under the excuse of tying a shoelace, avoiding each their eyes. A pair of joggers slowed, glanced over for a moment, then immediately sped up. That collective turning away made Elena understand that people were not only afraid of Doyle, they were afraid of something bigger than him. Something that had turned this entire park into forbidden ground for the truth. Doyle did not wait for Elena to regain her footing. He grabbed the collar of her reflective vest and dragged her along the path, hauling her like an obstacle rather than a human being. This is the third time I've asked. What did you pick up off the ground? He tightened his grip on her wrist again, as if trying to crush the silence she was struggling to maintain. Dry leaves scraped along under their feet, producing a heavy, rasping sound. Elena fought to keep her breathing even, feeling the pain radiate from her wrist up into her shoulder. She knew that one wrong word would give Doyle the excuse to do more than detain her. Just trash, she answered, her voice weak but clear. A truth you're so afraid of, that you have to drag me like a dog. The words burst out, not as a challenge, but as a strike aimed at the cowardice hidden beneath his violence. Doyle's lips twitched sharply. That sentence pushed him from suspicion into real rage. He stopped abruptly, making Elena stumble and nearly fall. "What did you just say?" he roared, his breath heavy enough to swallow the air between them. Elena did not answer, not out of fear, but because she knew any words now would become fuel for the brutality he was barely restraining. He shoved her hard against the patrol car, parked beneath the trees. The impact sent a jolt of pain through her back, her breath breaking into a sharp gasp. The sweat at the nape of her neck turned cold as Doyle leaned in close, his eyes dark and dense, no longer bothering to hide the threat. "Who do you think you are? You think you can play law with me?" He pressed down hard on her shoulder, pinning her against the car door. A group of young people sitting on the grass in the distance looked over, just long enough to understand that no one wanted to be involved with Doyle. They turned away almost immediately. The park, usually loud from morning through midday, had grown so quiet that Elena could hear leaves falling onto the hood of the patrol car. That silence felt like a reminder of Arthur's fate, and it made time seem to compress, thickening into a few deep, suffocating seconds. Doyle cuffed Elena swiftly, the motion sharp and practiced, as if he were accustomed to doing this to people who could not fight back. When the cuffs snapped shut, pain shot through Elena's wrists, but stronger still was the sensation of her body being stripped of its freedom. "Stand still," Doyle barked, even though his hand still pressed unnecessarily hard against her shoulder. "Only criminals shake like that." Elena turned her head and looked straight at him. "If you think arresting a park worker is a victory, then yes, I'm shaking." The words made Doyle's jaw twitch. A half-second later, he yanked open the car door and jerked her forward, shoving her inside. As Elena fell onto the back seat, the icy metal of the car pressed against her spine. Doyle stood outside, his shadow blocking what little light entered through the door. He bent down close to the opening, his voice low but venomous enough to make the car feel smaller. "Take this one back to the station. Let's see how long it can stay tough." The car door slammed shut. The sound of steel striking steel echoed through Elena's head, and the darkness of the back seat closed in like a trap. And in that moment, Elena felt with absolute clarity that the park's silence had given way to something else entirely, something moving closer, faster, and far more violent than the wind. The air inside the interrogation room at Hawthorne Ridge Station always carried the smell of metal mixed with the dampness of old walls. The harsh white-blue glow of the neon lights washed over everything, making the room feel like a place designed to strip people of their dignity. Doyle shoved Elena into the metal chair at the center of the room, the force strong enough to send it sliding a short distance across the tiled floor. "Just a low-level worker who likes to stick her nose into forbidden business, huh?" he shouted, his voice echoing off all four walls like a charge already prepared in advance. Elena did not respond. Her wrists still throbbed from the tight cuffs, but she kept her back straight, her eyes lifted rather than lowered. She knew that in a place like this, silence itself was a minefield that made those accustomed to shouting begin to lose their balance. A young officer just coming on shift, thin-framed with a smug look in his eyes, stepped forward as if he were being handed a new toy. "All right then, let's see what a city worker carries around. Candy, tissues, a cheap water bottle." Each item he named added another layer of mockery to his tone. He shoved his hand deeper into the back pocket of Elena's vest, then suddenly froze when his fingers hit metal. "What the hell is this heavy thing?" he muttered, pulling out a small rectangular object, its metallic surface flashing under the neon lights. When he realized it was a Department of Justice identification card, he threw his head back and laughed, the sound shrill and grating like a dull blade scraping steel. "Oh, wow! This must have cost you a bit to print, huh? Nice idea. Playing federal cosplay to scare people?" Elena looked straight at him, her eyes darkening, her voice low but sharp. "Read it properly before you open your mouth." The words made him falter for the briefest moment, small, but enough for Elena to know she had struck his pride. The young officer snorted, scrambling to recover his arrogance. "You think we're stupid? Fake papers are easy to spot. DOJ, letting some nobody like you carry a badge?" He waved the card in front of her face like a joke already decided, his eyes fixed on her as if victory were assured. The door burst open, the hinge letting out a sharp metallic snap. Lieutenant Holt walked in, his face wearing the familiar irritation of someone who believed he was being interrupted by something trivial. "What's going on here?" he asked, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on Elena like an unexpected thorn that had grown in the wrong place. The young officer quickly tossed the card toward Holt, his voice full of confidence. "This one's carrying a fake federal badge, Lieutenant. Take a look for a laugh." Holt caught the card, his movement casual, but his eyes began to narrow. He turned it under the light, the neon glow sliding across the metal surface and revealing every etched detail. He scanned the identification markings, the embossed seal, the Department of Justice stamp pressed into the corner. Holt's jaw tightened as the light traced lines too precise, too real to be forged. The room grew so quiet that the ticking clock on the wall could be heard marking off a few beats. The young officer still stood there with his arms crossed, waiting for Holt to laugh and praise him for catching a fake. But Holt did not look at him. He looked at Elena. He looked for a long time. The expression in his eyes was no longer the usual contempt of a man in power. It shifted into something heavier, more dangerous. Recognition. Elena remained still, her gaze calm as a lake at night, giving the unsettling impression that she was the one examining him. Veins stood out on Holt's hand as he folded the card back together, biting down on his lower lip to suppress his reaction. His silence unsettled the room, especially the young officer. In a cautious voice, he asked, "Lieutenant, it's real?" Holt did not answer right away. He set the card down on the steel table, the sound of metal striking metal ringing like a full stop at the end of the arrogance that had filled the room moments earlier. He spoke slowly, one word at a time. "You said this one was carrying fake identification?" His eyes cut sideways toward his subordinate, as if piercing straight through him. The young officer went pale, stammering, I thought." Elena observed everything from her seat, her hands cuffed, but her posture steady, like someone sitting exactly where they belonged. Holt drew in a deep breath, forcing himself to regain control, but the urgency was clear in his eyes. He understood this was worse than a mistaken arrest, worse than a procedural error. A federal prosecutor was sitting in his interrogation room, detained under the guise of a park worker, and if she spoke even half the truth, the entire system he had built in Hawthorne Ridge would collapse. He turned to Doyle, his voice low. "On what grounds did you bring her in?" Doyle stood straight, the defiance still present, but already cracking at the edges of his eyes. "Disturbing the peace, digging around in a restricted area, disobeying orders." Holt snapped back. "Do you have evidence?" Doyle fell silent, confronted with a simple question he had never before been required to answer. Elena spoke then, her voice smooth but sharp as a blade cutting through the stillness. "I was brought here to pick up trash." Doyle spun around. "Don't make things up." Elena met his stare. "Then, what exactly are you planning to write in your report? That you handcuffed someone for collecting trash during their assigned shift?" The question hit the floor like a switch, cutting the sound from the room entirely. Holt tilted his head, looking at his two subordinates as if reassessing their chances of surviving the crisis unfolding before him. The young officer swallowed hard. Doyle clenched his fists, as if trying to crush the air itself. And Elena sat there in silence, letting that silence suffocate the entire room. Holt picked up the card again, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. He took another deep breath, then looked at Elena with an expression stripped of all condescension, replaced by something she recognized immediately: the fear of a man who understood that the person before him could destroy his entire police station. The interrogation room at Hawthorne Ridge Station seemed to shrink as Holt stood motionless beneath the neon lights, his hand gripping the Department of Justice identification card so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. The other officers watched him. Some swallowed hard, others avoided Elena's eyes as if afraid of seeing something they were not meant to know. No one dared to breathe too loudly. No one dared to ask another question. Everyone waited for the judgment of the man standing at the crossroads, forced to choose a path from which there would be no return. Holt looked around and spoke, his voice low but heavy, like stone dropping into water. "No one says a word about this. Do you understand?" The sentence instantly sealed off every exit, thickening the air in the room. Doyle turned toward Holt, his face changing color. "Lieutenant? She's really federal?" he asked, like a man trying to measure how deeply he had just buried himself. Holt snapped back toward him, his gaze sharp enough to make Doyle step back half a pace. "If you ask again, you'll die first," he said, each word cutting deeply into the surface of the silence. Then he turned to Elena, his eyes no longer careless as before, but probing, as if peeling back layers of intent beneath her calm face. "What are you doing here?" Elena met his stare, her chin lifting slightly. "I'm picking up trash." "Are you so afraid of trash that you had to tie me up?" The way she said it sent a faint tremor through the room. Her voice was not loud, but it struck like a needle piercing the deepest place Holt wanted to keep hidden. Doyle ground his teeth, his face flushing red. "She's gone too far." He started to step forward, but Holt raised a hand to stop him, his eyes never leaving Elena. In those few seconds, Elena could feel what Holt was weighing. Not just her fate, but the fate of the entire operation he was controlling. Another officer spoke up, his voice weak. Maybe let her go? Say? It was a misunderstanding?" He did not dare look at Elena, clearly afraid that meeting her gaze might remind him of right and wrong, things this station had abandoned long ago. Holt turned on him, snarling, "Letting her go is the same as signing our own arrest warrant. Do you want to die?" No one answered. That sentence made one thing clear. Elena's freedom was their nightmare. Another officer tried to find an escape. Then, say she stole the prosecutor's badge? Say she impersonated someone? Holt shook his head immediately, his voice dry and flat. "The card is real. The code is real. The raised seal is real. She's no joke. He set the card down on the steel table, the cold metallic sound ringing out like a sentence being handed down. Doyle looked at Holt, then at Elena, his eyes searching for some explanation for this grotesque situation. So, what do we do now? Lieutenant, if she walks out of here, they'll ask about every last ant in this station. The remark revealed Doyle's fatal weakness to Elena. He panicked when faced with something he could not beat, could not threaten, could not silence by twisting an arm. Holt stepped closer to Elena, his footsteps heavy, as if dragging his cracking career with every step. He leaned in close to her face, the smell of cigarettes mixed with anxiety. You know too much. If you walk out of here. He paused, holding his gaze on her composed expression. We're finished. Elena did not look away. Maybe the problem isn't what I know, she said quietly, but what you've been hiding for too long. Her calm sent a chill down the spines of several officers, as if Arthur's ghost were standing in the room, looking at their guilt through her eyes. Holt stepped away from Elena and paced a slow circle around the room like a trapped animal. He was weighing 3 choices before him: release, buy her off, or eliminate her. Each option was rooted in danger, but only one was fast enough, clean enough, dirty enough to block every path that could carry the truth outside. One officer whispered, If we kill her, the feds will hunt us down to the end." Holt turned, his voice icy. "The feds don't hunt anyone if no one reports it." The entire room shuddered. Doyle licked his lips, his voice low but filled with expectation. I can handle it. No one will know." Elena heard that clearly and felt her chest tighten, but her eyes did not change. Holt looked at Elena again. Her silence frightened him even more. She did not beg, did not rage, did not react, and that turned her into a kind of power he did not know how to confront. At last, Holt exhaled, but the sound was like something breaking. "Lock her in cell number 4. Do not enter her name in the duty log." The order fell like a curtain closing over Elena's fate. 2 officers moved at once, one taking her arm, the other opening the door. Elena rose slowly, her back still straight, as if she herself were leading them into a place they would one day fear. Doyle followed behind, the tension rolling off him and almost brushing the back of Elena's neck. Holt watched them go and added, his voice lowered with grim intent, "Clean it up tonight, before dawn." The door of cell number 4 closed behind Elena. The lock turned with a sound like a blade scraping across steel, and in that moment of darkness, she understood that they had made their choice, a choice so dark that even Arthur beneath the ground would have shuddered. Cell number 4 sat at the end of the hallway in the Hawthorne Ridge station, where the lights were so weak that the shadows of the bars looked like long fingers reaching for whoever was inside. Elena lowered herself onto the cold floor, her back against the damp brick wall. She closed her eyes for a single beat, then opened them and began to count, each number leaving her lips like a lifeline anchoring her mind. 1, 2, 3. Each heartbeat became a way to keep her thoughts from being swallowed by the fear lurking in the silence. Water dripped from a leaking pipe in the ceiling, falling in steady taps that blended with her heartbeat and slowed time itself. Elena knew Holt and Doyle had not left her here to wait for a lawyer or any kind of procedure. They were waiting for the night to deepen, for the station to empty further. That truth made Arthur's face flicker through her memory, reminding her that she had stepped onto the same path he had been forced to walk to its end. Out in the hallway, footsteps echoed, heavy and deliberate, like the stamping of a death warrant. Doyle spoke loudly enough for Elena to hear, his voice thick with implication. "All it takes is one slip." "Who would know?" The words slid into the cell through the gap beneath the door, tightening Elena's stomach. He wanted her to hear. He wanted her fear to grow. He wanted her to understand that her fate had already been decided by him. Holt's voice followed immediately after, low and harsh. "No witnesses. No cameras. I'm saying this for the last time." The tone was nothing like it had been in the interrogation room. Gone was the arrogance of a man confident he ruled the entire town. What remained was the voice of someone struggling in floodwaters, knowing that a single mistake would drag him under. At the far corner of the hallway, Noah stood frozen, like someone who had just seen a disaster greater than anything he had ever imagined. His face had gone so pale that his lips had lost all color. He had seen Doyle beat people. He had seen Holt alter reports, but facing the intent to eliminate a federal prosecutor inside the station itself, he understood this line was an abyss. Once crossed, there would be no way back. Elena opened her eyes, sensing Noah's presence from the soft sound of shoes against the floor. She turned her head toward the bars, her voice low but sharp as a blade slipping through the crack beneath the door. "If you're the one who sent the letter, don't let me die for nothing." The words shook Noah. He had not expected her to recognize him from a single step. His throat went dry, his heartbeat spiraling, as if it were trying to break free of his ribs. He moved closer, standing right by the bars but not daring to meet her eyes for long. I can't let them do this," Noah replied, his voice trembling like a string pulled too tight. He was the only person in the station at that moment who did not want to see her disappear into the dark. And he was the only one who understood that if she died, the letter he had sent would become a crime he himself had planted. Elena looked at him, her eyes unwavering, despite the exhaustion in her body. "You have to act before they finish their plan. I don't have much time." Her calm stole a breath from Noah's lungs. He knew it was not a threat, but a statement of truth closing in. A truth that demanded a choice from him. Stay silent and keep living, or speak up to save the woman locked here because she believed in justice. Raised voices from Doyle and two other officers echoed from the far end of the hallway. Noah knew they were finalizing who would disable the cameras, who would falsify the shift log, and who would open the cell door. Each step of the plan was another brick added to a burden of guilt he could not carry. Noah pulled his phone from his pocket, his hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He stared at the dark screen, his finger hovering over the message field. He switched hands, trying to steady his breathing. Elena kept watching him, silent, her gaze like an anchor, keeping him from collapsing. Noah typed each word as if every letter were a knife cutting into the life he was living. "They have a federal prosecutor. Immediate assistance needed." He looked at the message, knowing that once he sent it, his life in Hawthorne Ridge would be over. He closed his eyes and pressed send. The soft chime of the sent message sounded tiny, yet to him it thundered like lightning. In that instant, his heart dropped, so heavy that his body seemed to lose its last warmth. He had betrayed all his colleagues, betrayed people who could kill him in an instant if they discovered the truth. He drew in a deep breath and stepped back from the cell, forcing himself to look calm. But his spine was ice cold, because he knew that even before the darkness faded, the danger had already begun to close in. Heavy footsteps sounded from the end of the hallway. Doyle turned back abruptly, narrowing his eyes as he stared straight at Noah. "What the hell did you just do?" The air suddenly thickened, like a lake freezing over after a stone was thrown. Elena heard every word and understood that the decisive moment was happening now. Noah stood there, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. And for the first time in his life, he had to face the path he had chosen. The hallway of the Hawthorne Ridge station lay under the sickly yellow glow of wall lamps, making everything look decayed, much like the very system now trembling in the dark. Doyle moved in close to Noah, his eyes narrowing like a hound that had caught the scent of betrayal. "Who were you on the phone with? Hand it over!" he snarled, each step heavy, meant to intimidate. Noah backed away half a step, pressing the phone tight inside his jacket pocket, trying to keep his breathing steady while his chest felt as though it were being crushed. Then, without warning, a piercing siren howled from outside the yard, a sharp sound slicing through the hallway windows like a blade splitting the air in two. Doyle froze, his eyes widening. That siren did not belong to local police, nor did it sound like an ambulance. It was a sound anyone who had ever heard it would recognize. Federal. An officer burst out of the duty room, his face drained of color, shouting, "Federal agents! U.S. Marshals!" Like a bomb detonating, the entire station fell into chaos. Chairs toppled, papers flew, curses echoed everywhere. No one had prepared for this, especially not in the middle of the night, at the exact moment they were about to erase a federal prosecutor. Holt stormed out of his office, his face flushed with panic. "Hurry! Wipe the cameras! Delete the reports! Pull the duty logs!" he shouted, his voice shaking. But the other officers only stared at one another, hands trembling, hearts pounding, as if they might burst from their chests. They all knew it was already too late. Heavy boots thundered at the front entrance, accompanied by sharp commands. The station doors were kicked open, as if the hinges were paper instead of metal. A wave of marshals flooded in. Black uniforms, ballistic helmets, weapons raised, flashlights carving harsh beams across the walls. "Nobody move. Hands on your head. Face the wall." The commanding agent's voice rang out like a hammer striking stone. The officers inside froze instantly, some throwing their hands up as if to prove innocence they knew was already meaningless. Doyle turned as if to run, panic visible in every step. But a marshal lunged forward and slammed him to the floor in an instant. "Let me go! You've been fooled! She's crazy! She set this up!" Doyle screamed, his voice cracking with rage and fear. The madness in his eyes made the hallway seem to vibrate. No one paid him any attention. Another group of agents moved straight toward the holding cells. They unlocked the door, the steel gate swinging open to reveal Elena leaning against the wall, her face marked with bruises, yet her eyes chillingly clear. The harsh beam of a flashlight swept over her, making her squint slightly, but she did not recoil. She sat upright, like someone who never allowed herself to collapse in front of anyone. A marshal crouched down, his voice firm but gentler. "Miss Ward, can you hear me?" Elena lifted her chin, her voice soft but clear, like metal striking metal. "Thank you. You're a little late." The reply made the agent press his lips together, caught between respect and pain. Out in the hallway, Holt was being forced against the wall. His hands wrenched behind him in cuffs. He struggled hard, his face red with the effort of fighting the reality swallowing him whole. "You don't understand this," Holt shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "She came to destroy all of us. She's bait. You're all fools." But his words dissolved into the sound of boots, shouted orders, and the snap of locking cuffs. Elena was helped to her feet. Two agents supporting her arms as they guided her down the hallway like a survivor being led out of a nightmare. She felt the cold night air rush in, carrying a different kind of wind from the suffocating atmosphere of the cell. The red and blue lights of the marshal's vehicles flashed relentlessly, bathing the station yard in a harsh glare that seemed to dissect every secret. As she passed the far end of the corridor, Elena glanced to her right. There, leaning against the wall, his face white as someone who had just watched himself laid bare, stood Noah. His eyes clung to her. In them was not only the fear of being exposed, but also the terror of realizing that everything he thought he knew about this town would collapse within hours. Elena looked at him for a single second and said nothing. But in that look, Noah understood two things. She knew he had saved her life, and she knew he had just placed his entire future on the scale with the truth. It made him tremble one heartbeat more. Doyle was dragged past, his eyes bulging, his mouth still screaming like a man stripped of the power to decide who lived and who died. She sabotaged everything. She ruined it all. Holt, meanwhile, stared at Elena through the cluster of agents, his gaze like that of a man watching floodwaters swallow the house he had spent years building. He muttered something, but was shoved hard into a patrol car. The night wind grew stronger as Elena stepped down from the station's front steps. The cold air stung her eyes, but she kept her balance. The marshals opened the door of an armored vehicle and helped her inside. She looked back at the station one last time, the place where they had planned to kill Arthur, where they had planned to kill her, where the darkness had seemed untouchable. Then her eyes found Noah again. He stood beneath the hallway lights, his hands clenched so tightly they had gone white. And in the instant the light reflected in his eyes, Elena saw something Doyle would never understand, Holt would never control, and all of Hawthorne Ridge had been afraid to face. The real fear had only just begun. The Federal Forensics Lab lay deep on the third floor of the U.S. Marshals headquarters, where cold white lights washed over everything, as if stripping the world bare of its layers of deceit. On the steel table before them was the shard of glass Elena had found at the base of the tree, sealed inside an evidence bag, its surface still bearing a dark brown smear that faintly caught the light. A forensic specialist leaned close to the microscope, adjusted the focus, then spoke with the certainty of a stamped seal. The blood on this shard is a complete match to Arthur May's. There's no possibility of error. 7. The words echoed through the room like hinges opening a door that had long been locked shut. Elena stood nearby with her hands clasped together, and at the sound of that conclusion, her fingers tightened slightly. It felt as though Arthur had been restored to the very existence Holt and Doyle had tried to erase. The forensic technician continued explaining cellular structures and DNA analysis, but Elena no longer heard every detail. What rang clearest was this: Arthur Mays had not died in silence the way they had intended. A digital technician entered the room holding a small flash drive. "We managed to recover part of a video from his old phone," he said, and the room fell quiet with expectation. That phone had been found among Arthur's stored belongings at the shelter near the lakeside. An object thought worthless, yet one that carried the lifeline of the truth. When the video began to play, the image was blurry and shaking, wind noise mixing with Arthur's ragged breathing. The angle revealed a patrol car with its lights off, parked crookedly beneath the trees. Arthur's voice trembled through the screen. Don't come near me." Then the image plunged into darkness, a clattering sound like the phone hitting the ground. A heavy impact followed before the video cut out abruptly. No one spoke for several seconds. Mercer stood a short distance away, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze heavy, as if carrying the entire darkness of Hawthorne Ridge on his shoulders. He spoke quietly. "They killed him. There's no doubt." Elena did not turn to look at Mercer. She replied, her voice low but hard as steel, "And they would have killed the next person if they hadn't been stopped." The words made several agents pause, because they all knew who the next person was meant to be. Federal agents began discussing around the large table, spreading out a map of Hawthorne Ridge marked with red dots showing patrol car stops. One pointed at the screen. "We scanned GPS data over 3 months. There are more than 20 irregular stops, mostly along the park's edge, and 2 deserted roads near the city's old storage depot." Another added, "The timing aligns with the descriptions in the anonymous letter. Most occurred during the shifts of Holt, Doyle, and Brigden." Mercer looked to Elena, silently asking whether she recognized the pattern in the data. Elena nodded slightly. "The park is only part of it. They set up exchange points right in the place people believed was safest. If this is accurate, then we're looking at something much larger. A web." The thought brought back the looks on the faces of the park's residents, guarded, evasive, cold. They had known something. They had known for a long time. The forensics lab door opened as a female agent stepped in with a report in hand. During the seizure of Holt's belongings, we found 2 memory cards hidden inside an old ventilation duct in his office. There are signs of file deletion, but we're in the process of restoring them. Elena looked at the cards in the agent's hand, as if seeing another crack form in the wall Holt had spent years building. Mercer said, "The scene photography team is working at the park. They've recovered fibers caught on tree number 12, most likely from when Arthur was dragged." Elena inhaled, catching the faint metallic scent of the lab. Arthur tried to leave something behind: the glass shard, the phone, the blood beneath the leaves. He couldn't escape, but he made sure he didn't vanish. Several agents leaned in, replaying the video once more. One of them said, "He tried to turn the camera toward the person approaching him, but the light was too weak. With further enhancement, we might catch a silhouette." Elena stood still, her hand unconsciously touching the bruise on her neck from the violence at the station. Somehow, she felt Arthur pulling her toward the truth, as if speaking to her in that hoarse, fading voice. "Do not let them turn me into nothing." At the far end of the room, a board covered in pinned notes slowly revealed the structure of the drug network. More than a group of corrupt officers, it was a web sunk deep into every corner of the town. Arthur's death was only the first leak. The blood-stained shard of glass became the drop that caused the hidden cup to overflow. When the discussion concluded, Mercer placed his hand on the table, his voice firm. "This is no longer an isolated homicide. This is a severe civil rights violation, an organized abuse of power, and an obstruction of justice. We're opening a full investigation." Elena answered, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm in at every step." Mercer regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "You're the one Arthur Mays left the trail to. You have to see this through. Is also wires." The meeting slowly broke apart, each person leaving the lab carrying thick folders of notes. Elena remained for a moment, looking at the shard of glass sealed in its evidence bag. Something so small had become the stone that began collapsing an entire system of lies. When she left the room, Elena stepped into a quieter hallway. Her footsteps echoed in short beats, as if Arthur's own steps were trailing faintly behind her. She had only gone a few paces when her phone vibrated softly in her jacket pocket. A message from an unknown number read, "You shouldn't dig any deeper. Some people in this town don't want the truth to survive." Elena stopped, her palm turning cold. Not from fear, but because she knew the battle had begun to leak forward in the only way truth ever does, from a small crack that eventually sweeps away everything standing in its path. The afternoon settled over Green Line Park with a dull gray light that made everything seem wrapped in a heavy mist. Elena walked slowly along the path leading to the drink stand, where Jessie Bloom usually stood brewing tea for customers, but today she looked like someone trying to withdraw from her own life. When Elena stopped at the counter, Jessie was lifting a cup and looking up. "What did you see on the night Arthur died?" Jessie flinched, her hand shaking so badly that the cup slipped and fell onto the wooden counter. Jessie bent down to wipe the spilled water, her fingers trembling like dry branches in the wind. I didn't see anything," she said, her eyes darting from side to side as if afraid someone might hear. "Everyone here knows. If you look too closely, you don't live long." The scent of mint from the hot tea spread through the air, but it could not mask the fear clinging to Jessie. Elena kept her voice gentle so as not to make her shrink further. "If you speak up, you won't be alone," she said. "I can protect you." Jessie lowered her head, her voice dull like ashes. "No one can protect anyone from the police." Elena stood still for a moment, looking into Jessie's exhausted eyes, and understood that this story was about more than a single death. It was a darkness that had hung for months, a darkness people had learned to live with by staying silent. She left the stand and walked toward the maintenance area behind the storage building, where old concrete walls had absorbed rainwater, and the flickering fluorescent lights breathed like something barely alive. Inside the maintenance room, Marcy Linton was sorting equipment, and startled when Elena entered. The door had not yet closed, letting a hiss of wind slip through the crack, sounding like a warning. Marcy leaned against the wall, her hands clasped together, unsure where to put them to stop their shaking. "I heard the screaming," Marcy said, her voice so small it seemed afraid the memory itself would burst from her mouth. Then the sound of someone hitting the tree. "But I didn't dare run out." Elena stepped closer, her gaze softening. "How afraid are you of them?" Marcy looked straight at her, as if measuring whether Elena could withstand her fear. "So afraid that I don't even dare cry out loud," she answered, her chest rising and falling with the admission. Elena recognized that feeling clearly, a fear so prolonged that the line between silence and despair no longer existed. Marcy fell silent for a moment, then opened an old wooden cabinet and took out a small, clear plastic bag. Inside was a face towel, its edges frayed, stained with a dried brown mark. "I was washing park laundry that day," Marcy said, her fingers brushing the bag as if touching guilt itself. "This towel, it doesn't belong to any of us." Elena reached out and took the bag, the cold of the plastic making her instinctively tighten her grip. The trace was small, but it was a vital piece of the truth Holt and those behind him had tried to bury. Marcy looked at Elena, her voice cracking like a breaking leaf. "Please don't let me die for saying this." Elena placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling Marcy's body stiffen with fear. "I promise," she said, "but to protect you, I need the truth." Marcy nodded, tears falling in heavy drops, like someone who had carried this inside for far too long and could finally no longer bear it. Outside, the wind grew stronger, carrying the sound of leaves scraping together like whispers in the trees. Elena stepped out of the maintenance room, gripping the bag with the towel, her chest heavy with the sense that something was pressing her down a path with no way back. The afternoon light faded toward dusk. The long shadows of trees stretched across the path, making her feel as if she were crossing milestones of a journey whose end she could not yet see. As Elena neared the rear yard, she suddenly stopped. Two officers stood near the iron fence, both staring straight at her without any pretense. They stood upright, arms crossed, their gazes cold and wordless like a wall. Elena did not blink, but she felt the shift in her heartbeat. One of them was the same man who appeared in the video Arthur had recorded, the one present at the scene before Arthur's final breath. Elena did not turn away, did not speed up or slow down. She kept walking, the sensation of her feet pressing into the damp ground, like stepping on a secret, not yet dry. The officer's stare never left her, as if he were counting her breaths, waiting to see when she might cross a boundary they would not allow. The heat of that gaze followed Elena until she turned toward the exit, and she felt an invisible hook catch onto her. It did not pull her back, but it told her clearly they had seen her steps in this darkness. The two men remained where they were, their eyes sharp as blades, signaling that from this moment on, she was no longer an observer. She had become someone they would have to watch. As Elena walked farther away, the wind whistling past the maintenance buildings sounded like a reminder that the town's silence was being peeled away by her hand, layer by layer. And with each layer stripped away, another life might be placed upon the scale. The morning of the grand jury hearing weighed like fog, settling over the federal courthouse, the early sunlight slanting through tall windows, and turning the long hallway into a tunnel, leading to a place where lies no longer had room to breathe. Noah Bennett stood outside the hearing room doors, drawing in a deep breath and feeling as though no air would enter his lungs. His wrists felt icy, as if bound to an invisible rope pulling him back toward Hawthorne Ridge, where months of fear had taken root in every bone of his body. When the doors opened, Mercer stepped to his side, his voice low and firm, like someone who had watched hundreds of people fracture under the pressure of an oath. "You're standing before a grand jury," Mercer said. "Every word stays forever." Noah swallowed hard, the reminder landing like a verdict not yet spoken. Then he saw Elena seated in the front row, her calm, steady gaze anchoring the last bit of breath he had left. She gave a slight nod, a gesture carrying the meaning that this was the only path left if he wanted to live clean for the first time in his life. Noah stepped into the witness box, the white light overhead exposing beads of sweat running down his temples. When the prosecutor asked the first question about the night Arthur Mays died, Noah's knees nearly buckled. I saw Doyle drag him behind the tree," Noah said, his voice rough like dry leaves being crushed. The words came out weakly, yet the hearing room was instantly shaken by complete silence, a silence heavy with the weight of truth, breaking free from a wall of fear for the first time. One juror leaned forward and asked, "Did you try to stop it?" The question plunged straight into Noah's conscience like a twisting blade. He lowered his head, his hands clenched together until his knuckles turned white. I was afraid," he said. "I didn't dare." Some people in the room sighed, others looked at him with disappointment. But Noah did not look at anyone. He stared at the wooden surface of the stand, where old scratches looked like confessions carved by years of silence. Elena held her pen, taking notes, but her eyes never left Noah. When it was her turn to ask a question, her voice was so even that the entire room seemed to gather into a single point of stillness. "What did Holt say afterward?" she asked. Noah drew in a breath, but it broke halfway. He said, "There is no old man here. Not anywhere." The room slowly lifted its collective gaze, because those words were not just about concealing a death. They were the declaration of a man who believed his power was enough to erase a human being from the world. The air in the hearing room thickened, as if even the walls were leaning in to listen to what was being unearthed. Mercer stepped closer to the screen and displayed GPS data from the patrol cars. "Talk about the delivery network," he instructed. Noah closed his eyes, then answered, "The patrol cars weren't just for patrol, they were delivery vehicles." The statement dropped into the room like a stone thrown down a deep well, its echo reflected in every face. Another juror asked, "How long have you known?" "About half a year. I saw them stop the cars repeatedly in the park, and strangers came to collect packages." Sweat slid down Noah's neck into his collar, and in that moment, he was no longer a police officer. He was a witness to rot. When asked why he had sent the anonymous complaint, Noah almost had no voice left. "Because I didn't want to die like Arthur," he whispered. The sentence trembled like a string stretched to its limit, and Elena could hear the shame flowing beneath every syllable. No one in the room condemned him. His fear was the fear of this town, of people who had lived too long under the hands of those who wielded power without law. Elena set her pen down, stood straight, and looked at Noah without judgment in her eyes. "You're not too late," she said. "But from now on, you have to stand with the truth." The room fell silent at those words, not because they were encouragement, but because they were a choice Noah knew offered no path back. He nodded, his shoulders sagging as if a stone that had crushed him for months had finally been set down. The hearing continued for another 30 minutes, during which Noah detailed how Holt ordered reports erased, how Doyle intimidated sanitation workers in the park, and how other officers chose silence to stay alive. Each sentence from Noah landed like a hammer blow against the moral facade of the Hawthorne Ridge Police Department, exposing cracks that had existed for a long time. One juror shook their head. Another wrote continuously, while Mercer stood with his arms crossed, his face hard, as if a storm were being held behind his eyes. When the hearing ended, Noah rose, his legs feeling as though they were touching the cold tile of a new world. He stepped out into the hallway, the light falling across his face and revealing his exhaustion. Elena emerged a few seconds behind him, watching his long shadow stretch across the floor. She knew Noah had just broken free from an invisible cage he had lived inside for half a year. Noah pulled out his phone, intending to message his mother that he was all right. But the screen lit up before he could touch it. A new message appeared. Just 7 words, but enough to freeze his blood. Traitors don't usually live past this winter. His fingers trembled, the phone nearly slipping from his hand. He lifted his head and looked out toward the courtyard in front of the building, where the wind blew hard enough to snap the American flags. Winter had not yet arrived, but that threat made his entire body feel as though he had stepped into the heart of the coldest month. Elena stepped closer and asked quietly, "Noah? What is it?" But Noah hid the screen and only said, "They're not going to leave me alone." Elena looked into his eyes and saw fear thick and heavy. But she also saw something new, a faint light. The light of someone who had told the truth for the first time in his life. After Noah's hearing, the federal headquarters seemed filled with a thicker layer of air, heavy with the metallic scent of truth newly exposed. Elena entered the briefing room, where Mercer and the agents had spread GPS printouts, town maps, and duty rosters from the Hawthorne Ridge Police Department across the entire table. The room was utterly silent. There was no longer any need for speculation. Everyone knew they were tracing the outlines of a criminal network operating from within blue uniforms. One agent enlarged the GPS map on the screen. Red dots scattered from Green Line Park to abandoned lots and narrow roads outside normal patrol routes. Mercer circled 3 points, clustered closely together. "Here," he said. Holt's patrol car stopped at the park 13 times in 3 weeks. No mission reports. Elena stepped closer, studying each red mark as if watching the pulse of a venomous creature. "Every one of these stops lasts under 3 minutes, she said. 3 minutes is the perfect window for a handoff without drawing attention. Another agent flipped open files from the evidence room. "The evidence locker has been missing items for 3 months, he said. "Heroin, fentanyl." But Brigden logged them as destroyed. No one double-checked. Elena leaned in to read the list, her eyes moving over Brigden's careless notes, his slanted handwriting seeming eager to deny itself. "No one destroys evidence late at night," she remarked, "unless they're trying to destroy their own tracks." Warehouse camera footage appeared on the screen. Holt was seen entering the evidence room at 2 in the morning, a sealed bag in his hand, the overhead light casting his shadow long across the tiled floor. An agent pointed at the screen. No access order, no paperwork. He went in when no one else was on duty. The room fell quiet, as if everyone felt the cold emptiness of that space, where authority had become a tool for crime that no longer bothered to hide. Elena folded her arms, her gaze sharpening. "They used the park as a transfer station," she said. "No one suspects police vehicles. It's the perfect cover." Mercer nodded, then slid forward a stack of new witness statements. One anonymous witness claimed to have seen Officer Doyle meet a stranger in the park, exchange something, then leave quickly. Elena read that passage twice. What rose in her was no longer surprise, but confirmation of what she had seen in Doyle the night of her arrest. The aggression was only a shell for the fear of being exposed. Beside that lay Holt's bank statements. A bank employee had provided them, along with the remark, "Funds were transferred regularly from the account of a small-time dealer in town. There's no legitimate reason for a mid-ranking officer to receive that money." Mercer pushed the statements toward Elena. "A network," he said. "And Holt sits at the top." Elena held the papers, looking at the steady figures like the even heartbeat of a living organism. "These aren't random transactions," she said. "They're fixed payments. Holt wasn't just protecting the operation. He was running it." The agents exchanged looks. No one argued. The network now stood clearly before them. From the evidence room to patrol cars, from the park to meetings in the dark, The scattered pieces had locked together into a complete machine. A young agent added another discovery. "We recovered deleted messages from Doyle's phone," he said. One reads, "Same spot. 10 minutes. Cargo needs to move now. Sent from an unknown number." Mercer leaned on the table, his hands clasped together. "So it doesn't stop at Hawthorne Ridge," he said. "Someone is coordinating this from behind the scenes." Elena felt a chill run along her spine at that realization. "Arthur saw something they didn't want anyone to know," she said. "And if they hadn't been exposed, they would have kept killing people like him and like me." Silence settled over the room, and for the first time since the night she had been arrested, Elena felt a slow-burning anger rise. Not for what Holt had done to her, but for what he had done to an old man who only wanted a place to rest his head. Mercer clicked open his pen, wrote a few final lines, then said, "That's enough. We can request warrants." His voice was so firm, the room seemed to tighten around it for a moment. "And this time, no one at the station will have time to erase evidence." Elena looked up at the large screen, where the map of Hawthorne Ridge glowed with red marks like dried bloodstains on stone. "If they have a tip-off, they'll run," she said. "We have to move now." An agent nodded. "My team is getting ready." Mercer turned to Elena. "You won't be part of the arrests," he said. "They already tried to kill you once." "I won't let that happen again," Elena replied. "I don't need to be on the scene. But I need to be here, because this truth is being peeled back, layer by layer, because of Arthur. I have to witness it." Outside the glass walls, the wind swept through the trees as if signaling that something in the air had begun to shift. The agents dispersed, carrying arrest warrants waiting to be signed. The federal headquarters grew busy, footsteps quickening, phones ringing more often, everything signaling that an operation had just been switched on. Elena remained near the screen, staring at the final red mark beside Green Line Park. A strange sensation coiled in her chest, the feeling of preparing to unlock a door with an abyss waiting on the other side. But she did not step back. Just as she was about to leave the room to return to her temporary office, Mercer's phone vibrated. He answered, listened for a few seconds, and his face tightened like a wire pulled to its limit. "Say that again," he said. The room turned toward him. Mercer ended the call and moved quickly to Elena. "Doyle and Brigden are gone from their homes," he said. "Someone tipped them off. Everyone." A cold wave ran down Elena's spine, not because they had fled, but because it confirmed something far more disturbing. Inside this town, among those who wore police badges, there was still someone watching their every move, hour by hour. Dawn in Hawthorne Ridge arrived with the pale gray hue of a day not yet fully awake. But before the sun even hinted at rising, a convoy of U.S. Marshals had already slipped quietly into town. Their headlights flared on at once, like an invisible execution order laid across streets long accustomed to calm. From the second floor of the federal building, Elena stood watching the map marked with containment positions, the sensation unmistakable, as if the heart of Hawthorne Ridge were being squeezed, beat by beat. At the front door of Holt's private residence, pounding knocks rang out in rapid succession. A marshal called loudly, "Gavin Holt, open the door. We have a federal arrest warrant." The door flew open, Holt appearing in rumpled sleepwear. His face drained of color at the sight of firearms angled downward in front of his home. "Gavin Holt," an agent read aloud. "You are under arrest for murder, federal corruption, and abuse of power." Holt stood frozen for several seconds, then said hoarsely, "You've made a mistake." No one answered him. On the eastern side of town, Doyle tried to climb over the fence behind his mother's house. Two marshals converged at once, slamming him down onto the wet grass. Doyle thrashed and screamed until his voice broke. "You don't understand! I was following orders!" His cries echoed through the narrow alley like metal, striking metal, furious and desperate at once. He was hauled to his feet, both wrists locked hard behind his back, eyes wide as he looked around like a hunted animal driven into its final corner. As for Brigden, he was arrested inside the evidence room itself. When agents stormed in, he was frantically typing at a keyboard, sweat dripping onto files not yet destroyed. "Stop! Hands off the computer!" A flashlight beam pinned his face. Brigden spun around, his hands shaking so badly he could barely move his fingers. I don't know anything," he said, his voice cracking like a child caught stealing candy. An agent stepped forward, pulled out a chair, and snapped cuffs around his wrists. "Don't know anything. But you're deleting data?" the agent asked. Brigden had no answer. By the time the sun rose, the entire town had heard. Residents gathered outside the police station, confusion etched across their faces. A woman clutching 2 children whispered, "So, it was all true? They really killed Arthur?" Beside her, an elderly woman leaning on a cane, eyes reddened, sighed softly. "I knew it. I've smelled that stench of death for a long time." Others stood silent, staring at the line of federal officers blocking the entrance as if guarding a cursed building. Elena stood at a distance beside Mercer, watching Holt being escorted to a vehicle. His face no longer carried its familiar arrogance, only a blend of hatred and fear. As he passed Elena, Holt paused for half a second, his gaze sliding across her like a blade. "You'll regret this, Ward," he said. Elena replied in a voice so cold, even Mercer glanced sideways. "You should save your breath for testifying in court." Holt was shoved into the vehicle, the door slammed shut, and the dry click of metal locking sounded like the first full stop ending his era. But the crowd did not clap or cheer. They merely watched the convoy drive away, the way one watches a storm leave town, knowing it has torn the ground apart behind it. Some people embraced each other. Others stood dazed. The system they had trusted for so long had been rotting in silence. Inside the station, the remaining officers were ordered to surrender their phones and access cards. One young officer broke down crying, gasping through uneven breaths. I didn't know they were doing those things." Mercer looked at him for a few seconds before replying, "Let's hope that's true. But now, you need to be completely honest." Elena stood behind him, listening to every word, as if reading entries from the torn diary of a shattered town. Near midday, television crews arrived, microphones thrust toward the crowd. A reporter asked, "Did anyone in town ever suspect Holt and his colleagues?" A middle-aged man stepped forward, his voice low and worn. Everyone suspected, but no one dared speak. In Hawthorne Ridge, sometimes silence was the only way to survive. Those words rooted Elena in place. She looked around at faces that had lived in fear for too long, every lowered head and every averted glance saying what no official report ever could. The truth had not killed this town. Prolonged fear had. Mercer came to her side, hands in his coat pockets, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "It's over." Elena shook her head slightly. "This is only the surface," she said. "The irregular stops, the steady payments." Holt wasn't running this alone. Mercer looked at her, accepting what he had long known but avoided admitting. "And you're still planning to follow it to the end." Elena looked toward the road where the federal convoy had disappeared. Wind moved through the leafless trees in front of the station, sharpening the cold in the air. "I have to," she said. "Otherwise, Arthur dies a second time." Einan. As the crowd began to disperse, Elena prepared to leave the area. But her steps slowed when she noticed a black car without plates parked along the curb. A man stood beside it, wearing a gray suit, his expression unreadable, eyes assessing her like a gemstone freshly unearthed. As she passed, he offered no greeting or introduction, only extended his hand and placed a thin card into hers. No logo. No markings. Elena Ward? He asked, his voice low but precise. If you're ready to face other towns, places even more suffocated than Hawthorne Ridge, call us. Elena looked down at the card. It was completely black, bearing only a small line of engraved numbers, so faint they were visible only when tilted under sunlight. When she looked up, the man had already opened the rear door and stepped into the car. Us? She asked. He answered only, You'll know when the time comes. The car pulled away, leaving a thin trail of dust on the road. Elena stood there, her fingers tightening around the card as if holding a new key to another door. Mercer approached from behind and asked, Who was that? Elena watched the vehicle disappear around the corner before replying, Someone who wants me to look beyond Hawthorne Ridge. Mercer exhaled. Ward, you just survived a night that nearly killed you. Take a break. Elena cut him off. You know I can't. Mercer studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then be careful. Other places. Aren't this place? And this place nearly killed you. Elena slipped the card into her jacket pocket, her chest heavy but not with fear. She understood now this was not an ending, but the threshold of a wider, darker, deeper road. Hawthorne Ridge had just been freed from its old grip, but she herself had stepped into a new one, the grip of justice itself. The first day of trial opened in an atmosphere thick with tension, as if all of Hawthorne Ridge were holding its breath after months of being suffocated by secrets and violence. The federal courthouse was packed, from reporters to residents, everyone wanting to witness with their own eyes the collapse of those who had once worn the blue of authority. Elena stepped into the courtroom with a feeling both familiar and strange. This place had long been a battlefield of reason for her, but today it held the soul of this town and the justice owed to Arthur Mays. Holt's defense attorney began with a posture of absolute confidence, as though he were defending a misunderstood hero. My client served this community for 20 years, he declared, his voice echoing through the room. He is not the monster the prosecution is trying to portray. Holt's life proves the opposite. A few townspeople nodded by reflex, something Elena understood all too well. In small towns, collective memory is fragile, and the image of a devoted officer can cast a shadow so long it blinds people to the truth. Elena sat behind the prosecution table, her hand resting lightly on the case file. A thought flickered through her mind. 20 years of service, or 20 years of building walls to hide crimes? The brazenness of the defense made her want to stand and object, but she remained silent, letting Mercer control the rhythm of the trial. The defense pressed what he believed was a weak point. There is no direct witness who saw Holt attack Arthur. Everything here is speculation driven by emotion. The statement landed, and a hush spread like a cloud passing over the courtroom. Mercer stood, his dark suit sharpening his presence. We have video, he said clearly. We have blood evidence, GPS data, and proof of concealment. Those things do not lie. Eyes from the gallery turned toward Holt, seated at the defense table. Holt clenched his hands, his knuckles whitening. He tried to keep his face cold, but his eyelid twitched each time Mercer listed another piece of evidence. When Arthur's shaky video was played, the trembling image and his unsteady breathing filled the courtroom, and a wave of silence washed over everyone. In that moment, Arthur was no longer a homeless old man. He became the final witness against the evil that had killed him. Holt's attorney sprang to his feet. Objection. The face in that video is unclear. It could be anyone. He spoke quickly, trying to mask the strain in his voice. But one juror glanced down at their notes and replied evenly, but only Holt was present in the park at that time. The remark cut straight into the vessel the defense was struggling to steer, forcing him to falter. The attorney tried again. There is still no direct proof. This is circular reasoning. But the air in the courtroom had shifted. Townspeople who had wavered now sat straighter, looking at Holt as a truth slowly dragged into the light. Holt began to lose control, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal searching for escape. Elena watched every reaction, sensing clearly that Holt no longer believed he was standing on solid ground. She saw his shoulders tremble when an agent testified about Holt entering the evidence room after midnight. She saw his jaw tighten when Mercer presented the bank statements. And she saw true desperation when the jurors kept writing, no longer looking at Holt with any trace of sympathy. After a moment, Holt's attorney shifted his attack. The prosecution wants you to believe a federal prosecutor was assaulted and wrongfully detained. But if she truly was federal, why was she disguised? Why did she operate outside the procedure? Or was she staging a scenario to smear local law enforcement? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Elena felt the focus turn toward her, but she remained composed. Mercer responded, "Miss Ward went undercover to protect witnesses and avoid contaminating the investigation. Unlike Holt, she had no reason to kill someone and then cover it up." The attorney folded his arms. No one can verify her motive. Elena lifted her gaze and met Holt's eyes. It was not the look of an innocent defendant, but of a man who knew the truth was tightening around his throat. When the judge called for a recess, the courtroom buzzed like a broken hive. An elderly woman whispered, "I heard Arthur's voice in that video. It really was him." A younger man sighed. "So this town was fooled for an entire year." Elena stepped back beside Mercer. He asked quietly, "Are you all right?" She replied, "Just tired. But I've been waiting for this moment since the day I picked up that shard of glass." Mercer nodded, understanding that she was not merely participating in a trial, but confronting the ghost of the night she nearly died. When the recess ended, everyone returned to their seats. The judge struck the gavel, its dry sound echoing through the wide room. "We will continue with testimony," he said. Holt's attorney rose, preparing a final assault. But the judge raised a hand to stop him. "Before further argument," he said, "the court will hear testimony from witness Elena Ward." It's another. A wave of silence spread through the room like morning fog settling over the town. Those standing, those seated, everyone turned toward the prosecution's bench. Elena drew a long breath, placed her hand on the table to steady herself, and stood. Holt immediately fixed his gaze on her, and in his eyes Elena saw two things clearly: hatred he could not swallow, and fear he had never revealed in any previous confrontation. She walked to the witness stand, each step heavy as memories returning. Her shoes struck the tile floor, the sound not loud, but heavy enough for everyone to feel the weight of the truth approaching. "Witness Elena Ward," the judge said, "do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Elena placed her hand on the Bible, her voice thin but firm. "I do." The courtroom fell completely silent, as if every breath had been suspended. The air in the courtroom thickened as Elena stepped onto the witness stand. Light from the high window above fell across her shoulders, stretching her shadow long over the cold stone floor. The entire room seemed held in a single, suspended breath, because everyone knew this testimony would be the blade that either severed the truth or saved what remained of it. Elena placed her hand on the microphone, feeling the cool metal as an anchor that kept her steady. "I was unlawfully arrested," she said, her voice even and clear. "No report, no reason, no warrant." The final words fell heavy as stone. A few jurors lifted their heads, others wrote continuously. Holt, seated at the defense table, shifted forward slightly, as if about to spring up, but his attorney placed a hand on his shoulder to restrain him. The defense attorney immediately cut in. "Your Honor, Miss Ward says this to conceal her unlawful intrusion into a park area under investigation. She is not telling the full story." He leaned into a mocking tone, hoping to shake the jury's confidence. Elena did not turn toward him, but looked straight at the judge's bench as if speaking only to the truth itself. "If you call picking up trash an intrusion," she replied, "then this park no longer belongs to the public." Holt slammed his hand on the table, muttering loudly enough for the room to hear. "This woman's insolent." The judge glanced down toward the defense, his eyes sharp as a blade cutting through the chilled air. "Mr. Holt," he warned, "one more outburst and I will remove you from this courtroom." Holt leaned back into his chair, but his eyes continued to burn into Elena. Elena went on. "I saw fear in their eyes," she said. "The people in the park that day. They were afraid I would see the truth that Arthur Mays saw before he died." A few murmurs rippled through the room, then immediately sank into a heavy silence. Juror number 3, who had been silent from the beginning, bent over their pad, writing densely, as if that sentence had opened an entirely new dimension of the case. Holt's attorney stepped closer, his composure no longer as smooth as before. "Miss Ward," he said, "what evidence do you have that my client intended to harm you? Or are you constructing a story born of stress and misunderstanding?" Elena tilted her head slightly, her gaze retaining the cold steadiness of someone who had stood before death and passed through it. "He ordered me locked in holding cell number 4, she said, each word ringing like metal striking stone. "No log entry. Anyone in law enforcement knows exactly what that means." The courtroom went completely still. A federal officer seated in the back leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his face darkening. Holt's attorney adjusted his cravat, his voice faltering. That is speculation. There is no evidence proving Mr. Holt gave such an order." Elena turned toward Holt, looking at him as if pulling the truth from behind eyes, shielded by years of arrogance. "He was standing less than 3 meters from me," she said. "I heard him clearly. He said, 'Put her in holding cell number 4. No one logs it. Is third.'" Holt shot to his feet, his face flushed as blood rushed up his neck. "She's lying," he shouted, his voice cracking through the room like fractured metal. The judge slammed the gavel hard enough to make several people flinch. "Sit down, Mr. Holt," he barked. "One more outburst, and you will be removed immediately." Holt looked around, searching for support in the room, but every gaze avoided him. Elena continued, her voice lower now but filled with force. "When I was taken into the cell, I did not hear a log being opened, and I did not hear any report being filed. I knew I had been placed outside all oversight. In a normal police station, that never happens." An older juror rested his chin on his hand, his expression thoughtful. The courtroom seemed to shift from suspicion toward serious attention. Holt's attorney rose again, trying to pull the trial back onto his chosen track. "You claim Officer Doyle assaulted you," he said, "but there is no camera footage of such an incident. What evidence do you have?" Elena did not evade the question. "I have bruises and hospital records, and I have the truth." Doyle did not ask for identification, did not read rights, and had no cause to arrest me. He grabbed my arm and twisted it behind my back, as if I were a resisting criminal. If you believe that is lawful conduct, then no woman in this town is safe. A wave of silence swept through the gallery. Elena felt the shift in the air from doubt to empathy, from defense to awareness. She looked directly at the jury and said, "If I had not been a federal prosecutor, but an ordinary citizen, I might have disappeared just like Arthur." Her voice did not rise or tremble, but it was enough to make several people in the back cover their mouths. Holt's attorney, now visibly rattled, tried to ignite a counterattack. "Miss Ward," he said, "you are describing an incident no one witnessed. That lacks a legal foundation." Elena tilted her head slightly, as if pitying his weak struggle. "There was a witness," she said, "Noah Bennett, and he has testified in full before the grand jury." A younger juror frowned. "Mr. Bennett's account matches every detail she just described." The defense attorney swallowed hard, searching for escape. Mr. Bennett is a subordinate officer. He could have been coerced or influenced by the media. Elena replied directly. If anyone was under pressure in that holding cell that night, it was me, not him. The courtroom seemed to freeze on that sentence. A woman seated in the back clasped her husband's hand, fear and a flicker of hope shining in her eyes. Elena realized she was no longer merely testifying before a court. She was recounting the battle every resident of Hawthorne Ridge had fought for years, a battle against silence, fear, and cruelty, hidden beneath a blue uniform. The judge regarded Elena as if weighing not her credibility, but the truthfulness carried in each of her breaths. "Miss Ward," he said, "is there anything you wish to add before the defense continues its questioning?" Elena inhaled, remembering the darkness of the holding cell, the smell of dried blood, Doyle's curses echoing in the hallway, and the unmistakable sense that she could die without anyone ever knowing. "Yes," she answered. "I want to say that I am alive today, not because of anyone in that police station. I am alive because someone risked everything to send a signal for help, and without that signal, Holt and Doyle would have succeeded." Holt lowered his head, his entire face tightening as if being strangled. His attorney moved to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand. "Let her finish." Elena looked straight at the defendant. "Mr. Holt," she said, "what you call protecting this town never protected anyone but yourself, and Arthur Mays died because you believed you had the right to decide who gets to live on this land." A pen slipped from a juror's hand, the small sound piercing the silence so deeply that even the ceiling fan could be heard turning. Holt sprang up, rage stripping away all control. "She's lying!" he shouted, veins standing out on his neck. "This is all fabricated. I never—" "Enough!" the judge roared, the gavel crashing down, its echo rolling like thunder. The judge fixed Holt with a freezing stare. "One more outburst, and you will be removed from this courtroom." Holt stood frozen. Elena remained on the stand, unblinking, and the entire room understood that just a few more sentences from her, and the mask Holt had worn for 20 years would turn to dust. The federal courtroom was so crowded that many people had to stand against the walls. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long streaks of light across the stone floor, yet it could not chase away the chill that hung over the room. The town of Hawthorne Ridge had been in turmoil for weeks, waiting for this final moment. And now every eye was fixed on the bench where the judge was about to deliver the verdict. Elena stood at the prosecution table, her hands lightly clasped in front of her. The judge lifted the heavy stack of papers and spoke with finality. "The jury finds the defendant, Gavin Holt, guilty on all counts." The words struck the center of the courtroom like a hammer blow. Some residents gasped. Others whispered prayers under their breath. Elena kept her face composed, but inside her a faint tremor stirred that she could not name. Not joy, not victory, but a release tinged with bitterness. Holt sat motionless in the defendant's chair. The face that had once symbolized power in Hawthorne Ridge now seemed to collapse inward, slack and pale. He stared into space, his eyes hollow, like someone severed from reality itself. 20 years at the head of the police department, 20 years of manipulation, intimidation, and concealment, now reduced to a cold sheet of judgment laid before him. Doyle sat beside him, his hands trembling slightly. He did not cry, but his eyes were red, like those of a man staring into a bottomless abyss. I did nothing but follow orders," he muttered, though the words were not directed at anyone in particular. Perhaps Doyle was trying to soothe himself, but he knew the truth better than anyone. He had not merely followed orders, he had reveled in that power. Brigden lowered his head, his voice so small it was nearly extinguished. "I was just following orders." But the judge paid no attention to that feeble plea. The sentencing was read slowly, each charge falling like gusts of wind battering a rotting house. He would face many years in prison, and his life ended, in all but name, inside this very room. Elena looked at them and felt a weight press against her chest, as if stones were piled there. There was no triumph, no sense of avenging Arthur. Instead, there was the exhaustion of someone who had walked a long road and witnessed the darkest parts of humanity laid bare in the light. Justice never wins easily, she thought, and the truth of it settled on her expression. Mercer stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The gesture was understated, yet it carried the recognition he had given her throughout the tense months behind them. "You did well," Mercer said quietly. "Arthur can rest now." Elena turned to him, her eyes softening for a brief moment. "Not yet," she replied. "This is only the beginning." It was not pessimism, but the voice of someone who knew that evil does not die with a single verdict. When the escorts entered, the clatter of iron cuffs echoed through the perfectly silent courtroom. Holt rose to his feet, but his legs seemed to fail him, forcing him to lean on the officers to stay upright. As he passed Elena, he drew in a long breath, as if trying to swallow the humiliation of being exposed before everyone. "You will not escape the consequences, Ward," he said, his voice low and thick, like the final curse of a desperate man. Elena met his gaze calmly. "The only consequences here," she said softly, "are the ones you created for yourself." Holt turned away, his jaw tightening until the tendons stood out beneath his skin. Yet his dark eyes cut into Elena one last time before he was dragged off like a shadow with no strength left to resist. Outside the courtroom windows, a strong wind swept through, sending dry leaves scattering along the walkway leading to the courthouse. The townspeople gathered outside, watched the transport vehicle depart, some sighing in relief, others bowing their heads in a grief they could not quite name. Hawthorne Ridge did not celebrate a victory. It ached at the confirmation that for so many years, the thing meant to protect them had been the very thing that made them afraid. Elena stepped out of the courtroom, her feet touching the cold stone steps. She looked at the street before her with a feeling both familiar and distant. This town had shown her things no law textbook had ever prepared her for. Arthur Mays, his name echoed in her mind like the call of a conscience. A life extinguished beneath the trees of a public park. And from that death, an entire decayed system was dragged into the light. Mercer walked beside her, his hands in his coat pockets. "Holt may appeal," he said. "The odds are low, but we cannot ignore the possibility." Elena nodded slightly. "I know, but whatever he does, the truth is on our side." A brief silence settled between them as they watched the crowd slowly disperse from the courthouse. Behind them, the courtroom doors closed with a hard, hollow thud. A strong gust of wind rushed across the steps, as if someone had opened a gate into another chapter altogether. Elena folded her arms across her chest, feeling the cold creep down her spine. It did not feel like an ordinary wind, but like a reminder that today's victory was not an ending. The aging houses, the silent corners, the averted glances, they were all still there. In a corner of the courtyard, a group of reporters still aimed their cameras at the prison transport. An older woman clasped her grandson's hand and said, "This day was bound to come. God willing, there will never be another like it." Elena heard her and felt her heart sink. She knew all too well that no one could promise such a thing. Mercer checked his watch and said, "Tonight, we meet with security. If Holt wants retaliation, you need protection around the clock." Elena shook her head. "If federal agents have to stand guard around my home, what meaning does all of this have? I do not want to live like someone under siege." Mercer sighed. "That is the price of confronting a system." Elena replied, "I understand. But do not let our fear create another system, just like it." is. They descended the steps together, merging into the current of the wind. Elena lifted her eyes to the pale gray afternoon sky, neither bright nor dark. A neutral, uncertain color, like the boundary between right and wrong she had walked throughout this case. Justice does not make anyone happy, she thought. It only makes things right, a little. And sometimes, that small correction costs an entire lifetime. The afternoon after the trial, the towering federal building stood still under pale light, as if it had just released a long, exhausted breath. Elena stepped onto the stone steps, her shoulders still carrying a weight that felt like the entire courtroom trailing behind her. The crowd gradually dispersed, each person leaving behind a faint trace in the air. Quiet sighs, murmured remarks, half-believing, half-doubting glances. Elena sat down on the stone step, folding her arms across her chest to hold on to what little warmth remained. No one was paying attention to her anymore. But to Elena, this silence carried more weight than any applause. She watched the faces passing in front of her. A frustrated man shaking his head. A mother pulling her child away from the reporters. A young couple whispering that they had lived next to police officers for decades without knowing what was really happening. Those looks made Elena exhale slowly. How many other towns are rotting like this, unseen? The thought pierced her mind like a cold needle, sending a shiver through her even before the wind arrived. A marshal's SUV pulled up nearby. Noah Bennett stepped out, wearing a thick jacket, his arm still lightly held at the elbow for security. He looked around as if trying to memorize the town one last time. When his gaze landed on Elena, he walked over and offered a trembling smile. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I hope one day I can come back under my real name." Elena looked into his young, frightened eyes and saw a loss she could not name. "You will," she replied softly. "Just not yet. Live first." Noah nodded, then was guided into the vehicle. The door closed, sealing off all sound, and the SUV pulled away, carrying with it a part of the story Elena had not yet fully understood. She followed the car with her eyes until it disappeared around the corner, her chest tightening with the knowledge that justice often arrives, accompanied by wounds no one can see. At the courthouse gate, a small family was placing a bouquet of white chrysanthemums on the steps. The man bowed his head, his hand trembling slightly as he tied a blue ribbon around the flowers. "For Arthur Mays?" he told his daughter, his voice catching. The little girl placed a small stone on the bouquet, as if trying to leave something behind for a homeless man she had never met. Watching them, Elena felt her heart constrict. Arthur had died alone, but at least today, he was remembered in the way people deserve to be remembered. Mercer emerged from the courthouse doors, a file in his hand but his eyes on Elena. He walked over and sat down beside her. "You can take leave," Mercer said, his voice low, not commanding. "This case took a lot out of you." Elena tilted her head, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly, as if she did not quite believe the offer. "Leave for what?" she said. "When things like this are not happening in just one place?" Mercer fell silent, then nodded, understanding that the stubbornness in her words was not defiance, but responsibility. The wind from the main road began to blow harder, whipping against Elena's coat until it flared like a sail in a storm. She hugged her arms, stood up, and looked down the long stretch of road ahead. Dusk was settling in, scattered streetlights flickering on, dimly illuminating the dust in the air. Everything looked still, like a frozen painting. Yet underneath it all were countless movements, fears not yet gone, questions unanswered, and dark corners no one dared to examine. Elena stepped down a few more stairs, feeling the wind coil around her legs as if trying to push her somewhere. Every breath she drew was cold, yet her mind felt strangely clear. She knew the case was finished on paper, but not inside her. A rotten system does not die because of one sentence, she thought. It only retreats underground, waiting to grow somewhere else. Mercer stood behind her and called out, "Ward, go home. Even one night of rest would help." Elena turned back and gave a thin smile. "I will go," she said, without promising when. Between them, the cold wind formed a fragile boundary between justice and truth, between ideals and human limits. She sat down on the stone step once more, feeling the cold seep through the fabric of her clothes. On the street, car horns echoed, a reminder that life continued, even as someone had just confronted the decay of an entire system. Elena looked at her hands, remembering each fragment. Doyle's shouting, Jesse's pleading eyes, the raw fear in every word Marcy spoke, and the hollow stare Holt wore when the sentence was read. All of it braided together into a cord that pulled her out of her last traces of innocence. The wind rose again. Her hair was swept aside, and she lifted her head to look at the sky, now turned the color of cold steel. There was something in the air, not unease, but something like an invitation. A new chapter, she thought. A door opening somewhere. A soft engine sound reached her ears. A long black car stopped at the base of the steps. No license plates, windows dark like the surface of a deep lake that reflected no light. Elena frowned slightly. The car did not belong to any federal agency she knew. The door opened. A woman in her 40s stepped out, wearing a black coat, her posture so confident it seemed to compress the space around her. She looked straight at Elena, her smile measured enough to avoid tension, but carrying no warmth. "Elena Ward?" the woman asked. Her voice was low, clear, and carried the weight of someone accustomed to making decisions in the shadows rather than the public light. The cold wind swept through once more, curling around Elena's ankles as if urging her forward. The wind on the federal steps lashed harder as Elena looked at the unfamiliar woman standing before her. Streetlights cast their glow across Mara Quinn's face, tracing a faint line along her cheekbone, making her look as though she had stepped out of a place that did not belong to ordinary streets. Mara regarded Elena with the confidence of someone accustomed to entering rooms where secrets were treated as shared assets. "We have been following the Hawthorne Ridge case. You did what many people would not dare," Mara said, her voice light yet carrying a weight that put Elena on guard. Elena straightened, keeping just enough distance to avoid being pulled into the woman's overwhelming presence. "And who are you?" she asked. Her tone held no suspicion, nor did it soften with curiosity. It was simply the directness of someone who knew that every word mattered now. Mara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a sleek black card. When the streetlight reflected off its surface, Elena saw a line of text, thin yet sharp as a blade. "We don't wait for justice. We ignite it." Mara held it out to her. "We are Project Rise. We do not wait for justice." Elena studied the card for a long moment, feeling a weight in her hand that went beyond a small piece of metal. It felt like an unspoken oath. When she looked up, she saw a man approaching from the other side of the car. His steps were steady, his gaze sharp, as if he had read Elena long before she noticed him. "Elias Kincaid." The man introduced himself in a low, calm voice. "And this country has many towns, like Hawthorne Ridge. Far more than you think." Elena observed him for several seconds. He did not resemble an agent, a politician, or anyone from the agencies she had worked with before. There was something in his composure that made her realize that the boundary between right and wrong, between law and reality, had never been the straight line she once believed it to be. Elena's fingers brushed lightly along the edge of the card, the cold sensation sliding across her skin, making her understand that this was not a simple invitation. It was a threshold, a sign that Hawthorne Ridge was only the beginning of a chain of events waiting for her in the darker corners of this country. "It sounds like you think I am ready to step into something bigger than my job," she said. Mara smiled faintly, her eyes seeming to pierce through the evening's cold haze. "It is not what we think. It is what you have already proven." When you stood alone against an entire system, you did not back down. Mara tilted her head slightly. People like that are rare. The wind swept across the steps, pulling Elena's hair to one side. She glanced back at the courthouse behind her, where the heavy wooden doors were now firmly shut. Inside lay a verdict that had ended a dark chapter. Yet within her, it felt as though that period was not enough to stop what was coming. "I have been standing for a long time," Elena said quietly. "I just did not know where I was supposed to go." Elias stepped halfway closer. "Then, starting today, you will not walk alone." He said it not as a lavish promise, but as a statement of fact. A fact that could change her path forever. Elena looked from Mara to Elias, realizing that both of them carried a resolve, forged in places darker than she had ever entered. Neither of them hesitated. Neither of them sought recognition. They operated where failures were buried, along with those who failed. "What is Project Rise?" Elena asked. Mara raised an eyebrow. "It is made up of people who understand that this system does not collapse all at once, but piece by piece. We find the weakest pieces and set fire to them." She glanced toward the courthouse. Hawthorne Ridge was only a small echo. Elias continued, "We need people who can see what others overlook, people who know how to listen to the silence of abandoned towns." He looked at Elena as if testing the strength of her footing after everything she had endured. "And sometimes, we need someone with the courage to survive after hearing truths no one wants to face." Elena drew in a quiet breath, feeling the cold slip into her lungs. Images filled her mind. Arthur, Jesse Bloom, trembling, Marcy Linto, and afraid to cry out loud. Noah stepping into the witness protection vehicle. All of those faces seemed to be waiting for her decision. "And if I refuse?" Elena asked. Mara shrugged lightly, as if the question did not concern her. "You will continue being a prosecutor. You will break more cases. But if you agree, you will see the disease at its root." Elias met her gaze. "And we will stand with you, in places others do not dare to go." Elena looked down at the card once more. No logo, no contact information, nothing but the short line of text. "We don't wait for justice. We ignite it." She repeated the words silently, feeling them strike like fire catching dry wood. She stepped closer to the black car. The wind at her back seemed to push her forward. Elena felt every heartbeat clearly now, no longer needing to count as she had in the holding cell. Her pulse was strong and steady, signaling that she knew where this choice would lead, even without a map. "All right," she said, not loudly, but clearly enough for both of them to hear. "I will listen to what you want me to do." Mara stepped aside and opened the car door. "No orders," she said. "Only work. And the flame." Elias nodded slightly, a wordless welcome. Elena stepped into the car, the black card still in her hand, streetlight reflections dancing across the cold metal surface. The door closed, the sound crisp and final, like a clean cut separating her from her old life.